Okay, so we're going to start with our first panel this morning. It's going to be on creating and managing DAOs here in Switzerland. We have a wonderful panel this morning with builders, with people who are really into the DAO community, and also lawyers who advise DAOs. So I'd like to start by introducing Anne-Grace. Anne-Grace is a DeFi lawyer turned DeFi builder with a background in academia. From Swiss financial regulations to MiCA market manipulation rules, she translates laws to other builders and crazy protocols to outside world as an advisor, speaker, and instructor. Sorry. Very good. So next we have Isla. Isla is the co-founder of FTW DAO, a social DAO with the goal of funding diverse founders globally and promoting diversity amongst capital allocators. Her background is in economics and innovation, and she began her career in traditional venture capital. Aside from FTW, she is also a council member at DAO Suisse, where she is leading the Founders Club working group. She's passionate about innovating on financial models and systems, and takes a strong interest in organization design, the future of work, mental health, Web3 models for impact. Next, we have Jessica Smith. So Jessica, she's not on the pictures we added her today because she is with Aragon, and we thought it would be a great add-on to our panel. So Jessica leads the communications and policy at Aragon, a project that builds DAO frameworks securing the governance of over 16 billion in assets. Prior to Aragon, she was a policy manager at Meta, an intellectual property lawyer, and a procedural agent in the Canadian House of Commons. She has a degree in conflict studies and a Juris Doctor from the University of Ottawa. Next, we have Ben. Ben Sen is an operations, legal, and finance advisor to several fintech startups. He has worked on setting up legal frameworks for DAOs and token issuing entities with both a Swiss foundation and association model, as well as Liechtenstein trusts. And last but not least, we have Florian. Florian received his MSc in quantitative finance jointly with the University of Zurich and the ETH in Zurich. He recently defended his PhD at the his PhD at the UZH Blockchain and Distributed Ledger Technology Group, and works as a research associate at the Zurich University of Applied Sciences. He conducts research on DAOs and on incentives in blockchain systems. Furthermore, Florian is a council member of the industry association DAO Suisse that promotes DAOs in Switzerland. So we're going to start this panel discussion with each one of our guests today, talking for a few minutes about their role, their involvement in DAOs. And Anne-Grace, we'll start with you.
I was first in line, so the involvement was mostly the setting up of DAOs, but now it's also already setting up I wouldn't call it DAO, but the community we want to have in the project I co-founded. And trying to figure out what exactly is the community. So it was always about trying to find the right fit, taking into account what exactly the community will be doing, how it will be structured, at least how the team, and this is the interesting part, sometimes you had a team that wanted to gather a community, and other times you already had a community that wanted to do something with themselves and get some more consistency. So it was trying to figure out how to match legal with the actual intentions and actions.
So I'm the founder for the WinDAO, and we set out, I came from a background in venture capital. I'd seen that there was too little diversity in the investors in venture capital, which was leading to far too little diversity in the investments being made. I ended up in the finance industry in banking, where we worked on an ETF product, and I spent about 2 years just looking at the data on investments and seeing that if you invest in diverse teams, you get significantly higher returns on average, and that seems to be fairly true across startups and larger enterprises, and also that the asset managers that invest in diverse teams tend to be diverse teams in the actual asset managers, and that they also perform up to 20% better. And that data is really consistent. And so I kind of came from that background and was struggling to find a structure of how do we get more diversity into asset managers and capital allocators. And had been working on the problem for a while, maybe 6 months, when I came across someone who knew about the LAO, and ended up being introduced to Aaron Wright. I think the first thing I found after I got into this was actually Sven's master's thesis. When you Googled DAOs in 2020, that was kind of one of the things that came up. And yeah, I was mind blown by the potential of DAOs to actually increase diversity in the finance industry, because for example, in the example of the LAO, which is a venture capital DAO, I think it was the first one to actually have a legal entity around it. They had 99 members, and when you compare that to a traditional venture capital fund where there's maybe 2 or 3 partners, the actual ability to increase the diversity in the industry is significantly higher. And beyond those 99 members, in theory, you can have unlimited number of members who are actually involved in the decision-making, in the capital allocation. And that was really what inspired me to get into DAOs and to start building for the win. Maybe a short summary of the experience. It's been wading through mud to kind of figure out, as one of the first DAOs that, well, not one of the first, I feel like that's two, but it felt like being one of the first, certainly. I think there were a few that came before us, but really trying to do things by the book in Switzerland, even though Switzerland is by far one of the best places to do it. There was just a lack of clarity. I think we spent 40,000 on legal fees and speaking to tax lawyers just to understand before we set out how to do things the right way. And we'd come from the banking industry, so we wanted to do things the right way. But now looking back, I think I very much resonated with some of the suggestions yesterday around having the sandbox for people to operate in. And I think it was one of your suggestions, Anne-Grace, because I think the biggest learning I have is that at the beginning, you don't know anything. It's very hard to structure something before you actually get going with a DAO and start working with the community and start working with the incentives. And it's very hard to time when is the right time to launch the token, because there's always, as you're writing a white paper, you're realizing what it's missing. And yeah, it's very tough. And I have to say, also very much resonated with Andrea's speech. There's so much potential here for innovation and design and social justice. But it's very hard, and we need to make it easier. So that's also why I became part of DAO Suisse. I'm very passionate about making this easier for other founders that will come after us. And I think Switzerland's one of the very best places to do it. So I'm excited to see that become easier. Thank you.
I'm Jessica. I lead communications at Aragon. So I do work in a non-legal capacity, and I'm non-practicing, so I'll just say that before we get into any of these topics, make that disclaimer. Aragon was the first to deploy a DAO framework, which is a set of smart contracts that enable organizations to deploy DAOs. And it powers the governance of projects like Lido, Decentraland, API3, and FTX. And that's really the focus of what we do, is building out this DAO framework and building tools for DAO builders. So that ranges from building the technology, but also assembling a community. We have a program called DAO Experts, of folks who can give advisory services to DAOs, and building education resources for anyone to be able to interact with the technology. So we just launched a new tech stack in March, from top to bottom, re-architected our DAO framework to be very lean and modular, so that it's easier to integrate with and easier to build novel forms of governance via via a plugin system. And we also built a new front end, the Aragon app, that makes it as accessible as possible to launch a DAO. So anyone can basically deploy a DAO, no code, under 10 minutes for 50 cents on Polygon. So that's the Aragon pitch in terms of what we do and the products that we build. In terms of my involvement in DAOs, Aragon as a project has undertaken many different initiatives over time and over the years to attempt to decentralize the governance of the project. So that has resulted in different rounds of experimentation, and that may or may not be something we get into a little bit later, but I did also have a role in some of these experiments in setting up Aragon's own kind of DAO initiatives for the governance of the project, which enables us to really understand and experience the technology firsthand and dog food our own products, as they say, and learn a lot along the way.
Great, yeah. Thanks, Sven, for the intro. So like Sven mentioned, I have a bit of a background in operational setup in different jurisdictions, but mainly Switzerland. So the thing that I think is really interesting about the Swiss case of how you set up DAOs specifically is that the legal wrappers here are relatively mature and well developed, and that means that we have significantly more precedent than certain other jurisdictions. And that is not just interesting for what people did refer to sometimes as wildcat DAOs, which are the ones that maybe do not really have that much of a regulatory framework. They often exist in common law. Here in Switzerland, we have pretty good setups for these things and also a lot of precedent. I would say that Aragon is actually a great example of this. The association framework is not that common yet. Most people still use the foundation wrappers for their TGEs, but for TGEs in general, I think foundations and associations both have their merits. For me, I really think that what is going to be interesting here is some of the precedent that Sven has described before, and that Florence has authored on. I think maybe some people don't know this, but actually during the DAO hack in 2016, a lot of these researchers were coming from Uni Neuchâtel and elsewhere in Switzerland. But yeah, that's basically my intro. I'm looking forward to getting some more practitioner examples.
Okay, then it's my turn. Also, thanks, Sven, for the introduction. So I started to be involved with DAOs from a research side because at the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, we did some research for some time on blockchain technologies, but in other contexts. And since I'm working there at the Institute for Organizational Viability, it was somehow close to organizations. And then we also started to be interested in DAOs, and mainly from an organizational design perspective. So how can you set up DAOs really from a traditional organization viewpoint? Because what we've found is that many of the DAO projects try to reinvent many things that have already been invented many years before by also traditional organizations, many processes, many organizational bodies or setups. So we try somehow to understand how we can translate some of the knowledge of this traditional organizational theory to DAOs and create some models and frameworks for this. By having then more and more conversation with also practitioners and researchers, somehow we found that there is a lot of uncertainty around many different topics related to DAOs. So of course on the legal side, but then also on the organizational side or the technological side. And through this we came up with the idea of creating an industry association that brings together different industry players and also researchers working on that topic. And so we founded the DAO Suisse, who has now more than 40 members, organizational members, institutional members, but also individuals. And the goal of DAO Suisse is to make Switzerland a go-to place for DAOs. And for this, we have different working groups where we bring people together to work on the legal questions, to work on the organizational questions, founders with Isla, and also a tooling group where people look at different tooling solutions, for example, Aragon. to develop eventually then some best practices or some guidelines to help people to set up DAOs in Switzerland. Also, as has been mentioned, as was mentioned yesterday, the DAO landscape in Switzerland is quite cluttered, so it's not so clear who is there. So we have also a project that is financed by InnoBooster, InnoSwiss grant, where we create a DAO radar, where we try to get all the data of the ecosystem to create and publish a report on all the DAO activities in Switzerland to inform the ecosystem, researchers, even politicians on what is going on in the DAO landscape in Switzerland.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of you for those introduction. So now it's going to be the time for a discussion between the public and the members of the panel today. But I'd like to kickstart the questions with as part of all of you are legal engineers or founders of DAOs. And you some of you are not from Switzerland. Some of you came to Switzerland particularly for the crypto space, for the DAO space. And I'd like to have your perspective of what does Switzerland bring to the table for the Web3 space. What is so special with Switzerland's legal framework, and also how could we even improve it? If you'd like to start, and Grace.
The beauty of Switzerland for DAOs. Probably there's a lot of options in terms of how to structure it as a legal entity. So any DAO that figures out that they need to interact with grant programs requiring an entity, they need a bank for whatever reason because the business requires a bank account that's only token only, they can figure out an easy setup for the entity. They can choose between many entities that were mentioned yesterday in detail and how you set it up. Like even the association can be used in so many different ways. You can put the DAO in, you can put it outside, you can try to make different things. So there are many options to have a tailor-made setup for your DAO. Of course, if you already know how the DAO looks like and how it's supposed to be shaped, but even if you're at a starting point and you just need a quick fix, there are options. And on top of that, and I would say this is the major point, there's a lot of other jurisdictions that can be cheaper, faster to set up, that make a lot of advertising as well. But in Switzerland, you have this additional layer where you can have legal certainty on what you're doing for your DAO. If you just have an entity, but the activities remain in some sort of shadow of how is it actually working out from a legal perspective, what's the point? Because the entity creates a necessary centralization point. And even, the one person as a director at that entity or anyone else will have some sort of liability for what is being conducted for that entity. So if you create it, but then you leave the entire regulatory aspects aside, what's the point? Because someone is just putting themselves in the spotlight out there and potentially will have problems subsequently. So the beauty of Switzerland is you can have an easy fix for the entity, maybe a bit more expensive than some other jurisdictions, but still there are options. There are some good solutions to have a one-click GmbH online or whatever else. Maybe this is not the best setup, but if it's just an arm to execute something, why not? It's not the association. Even the association can be quite a easy, it doesn't take much time. Now you need to register them in a commercial register most of the times, but it's not something that takes months to set up. And then on top of that, once you have a bit more funding, more members, you can also gain more clarity on the setup as well, or even you could have it before. So this combination of both aspects is the great part, especially if you issue tokens, if you end up in any financial setups, if you offer yield and this kind of things. It's nice to have a jurisdiction in which you have answers and you don't end up specifically compared to the US, for example, you have conclusions when you reach out to lawyers. In other jurisdictions, there's so much unclarity that they can't even decide on what is the outcome of your setup. So I would say this is a very good reason to justify the cost of coming to Switzerland.
I can only confirm. For us, it was definitely clarity. We were here, and we had sort of seen that Switzerland was one of the places where there were clear rules. So certainly, even though it did take us time and money, and I wish it had been cheaper and easier, the clarity that we were able to get, a clear ruling on how our token was seen and that it was, yes, a utility token was really important. In terms of how we could improve, I think there are a lot of standards and precedents, as Ben said, but I think that they're often a little bit tied in with who you know and who can tell you. The information is not that easily accessible publicly at the moment. I think it's hard if you don't know people in the industry to kind of get a clear picture of what is actually the case. So I think that there is an important role for us at DAO Suisse, but also for others to play in making some of these things a little easier and more accessible. One thing I think that I found quite difficult is kind of how we frame things to investors. And, you know, with a utility token, you're kind of the whole point is that they're not supposed to be investors. They're kind of purchasing a utility token. So as a DAO that kind of had a venture capital angle to it, it was very hard to find a structure that fully fit with what we were aiming to do. And I think yesterday there was a little bit of talk about the cooperative structure, and that's something that we looked at. But because the yield was limited to very low percentage along with the interest rates, it didn't feel like a doable thing, even though I do think the cooperative structure is interesting. To have a bit more flexibility for those kinds of use cases in or maybe like a specific structure targeted towards venture DAOs and generally just investable DAOs, and having more clarity. And even if it's not on the legal side, but just in terms of sort of best practices, you know, like in Web 2, we kind of have, you know, the safe and so you have the soft now in Web 3, but just having more of these standards of like, this is what you do when you want to do this, and making it just a little easier and clearer for people that are getting started.
Thanks. I think I'll start with taking a step back in terms of asking the question, like, why would you incorporate a legal entity and why would you choose a jurisdiction? Because DAOs inherently belong on the blockchain. It is an address that you can locate on the blockchain. And the blockchain has certain properties that one could argue are inherently political, like censorship resistance, capture resistance, borderlessness, etc. And if that's something that you care about as a project, and if that's part of the reason why you're building on the blockchain, this question becomes very important. And I feel like the presentations yesterday morning, the first early presentations, kind of gave a very good outline of those reasons for Switzerland. So the geopolitical positioning and the political climate is an important factor, I feel, is often overlooked. But then there's also the general orientation to innovation and the general orientation of the administration to one providing a certain degree of clarity and as much certainty as it can, so that you can build and innovate with a certain degree of stability and a certain degree of pragmatism. And there's also the open dialogue that's very interesting as well, and the ability to engage in constructive dialogue when you're grappling with new questions that haven't necessarily been explored before. So I feel like jurisdictions that allow you to do that are very powerful for these kinds of technology, and I think that's something that's unique about Switzerland. I think different jurisdictions will offer different benefits in terms of why you would choose to incorporate there. But really, I think it comes to being mindful and thoughtful of the goals of why you would incorporate entities when you're building on a blockchain, what their purpose is, and how they kind of fit into your overall mission and your overall roadmap and what they allow you to accomplish, and just not lose sight of the fact that DAOs and what we're building on the blockchain does belong to the blockchain it is built on, which can be seen as jurisdiction analogous potentially.
Yeah, Sven, is it okay if I leave the microphone on the table? Because I'm not really able to hold it cleanly today. Apologies for this. So something that I think is very important, probably 2 points. The first one is obviously jurisdictional precedent. And like Isla mentioned, it's correct. There is a lot of precedent, but there's not good documentation yet. And documentation is pretty important for this kind of stuff, because without any clean documentation, you do not really know what kind of steps you can take, and you don't necessarily know what the examples or case law will be. And secondly, obviously, is legal standing. This is something that Sven knows a lot about, and that revolves around recognition and the type of wrappers that you have to use. And obviously, we have currently two main ones, and then also the cooperative, like you mentioned. These are all pretty interesting, but really, without standing and recognition, it'll be tricky to go towards the further form that I know a lot of people have looked at, including Koala, in having potentially some kind of legal standing for a DAO as a sui generis entity that does not need an existing wrapper. And this is somewhere where I think Tennessee and other places in America have some example, but Switzerland is very interesting for that use case.
Thank you.
I may only add 2 points, or so, because many of the things were already mentioned yesterday. And of course, one of the interesting features about Switzerland is the aspect of direct democracy. And I mean, it's a no-brainer that this is somehow similar to what's going on in DAOs. But there are two aspects to that that I think are particularly interesting. So one aspect is that in a direct democracy, you need to have a lot of discussion. And I think this is something that is very important, can also be very beneficial for DAOs. As also Jessica mentioned, this dialogue with the industry in the ecosystem, but also with the authorities. So, I mean, here, I guess here in Neuchâtel, but also in Zug, maybe not so much in Zurich, it's very easy to get in contact with the authorities and talk to them about your ideas, your DAO projects, and the ecosystem. So I think this is a very interesting and very valuable point here in Switzerland. Sorry. And on top of that, what I think it's also very interesting, very important, because in Switzerland you have federalism, so you have all these different cantons. They are somehow sometimes very culturally different, as we also remarked yesterday during the dinner when we talked about fondue and raclette. But this can also be somehow translated to the DAO ecosystem or blockchain ecosystem in general, because you have not only this dialogue, but you have a dialogue of many different disciplines, of many different viewpoints. For example, I'm not a lawyer at all. I'm sitting here with lawyers, with you, or with legal people, with technical people, and we have this dialogue. I think this is a very, very important point in Switzerland.
I'm just going to add something on what you just said, the dialogue and how important it is, because in many jurisdictions I feel like there is one type of entity, one kind of setup that everyone loves, and they know that they want to attract all the DAOs to it, and they don't think further. In Switzerland you can have a debate on what exactly are you trying to do, and like there's a lot of lawyers, a lot of other people, like even FINMA is trying to figure out what exactly is the product trying to do, and that's extremely valuable. It's not just trying to put you in that one box that someone figured out for DAOs. Like these boxes may be very good, but you need a stage in your thought process where you just stop and like, what exactly are we? Which box is right? And it should be done before. And in many jurisdictions, once you just choose the jurisdiction, you only have like 1 or 2 boxes available. In Switzerland, it's as if you had like for a cat, it would be paradise. You have so many boxes you could choose from. And people help you to identify the right one.
Well, yes, thank you so much, all of you, for your comments. I think you all pointed out really rightfully how the Swiss legal system is really innovative, and there's this discussion that is possible with the authorities, which make it really easy for DAO projects, for crypto Web3 projects in general to establish in Switzerland. And going back to your point, Florian, I was wondering how do you all view Switzerland's democratic I don't have the word, but Switzerland is really, we have this culture of democracy, and how is this influencing also the crypto space? You know, since we have so many of those crypto projects establishing here in Switzerland, how is this being, how is our culture being imported into the Web3 space? It is maybe a little tough one.
I mean, just trying to give this a go. I think coming back to the previous point, knowing that the regulator is not going to make knee-jerk decisions, there's certain value put on consistency and careful, thoughtful discussion. I think that that's one thing that's shapes a certain confidence that I have that like we're good here. I do also think that maybe DAOs in Switzerland, I sometimes say that Switzerland is where DAOs go to grow up. So it's maybe not the cheapest place to do a DAO, but it's sort of a stable place with clarity. And maybe I do feel like the DAOs that are based in Switzerland, on average, are more serious about the actual intention to be a DAO than others. But that's maybe a big generalization. So I tried.
Thank you. Somebody else would like to comment? Yes.
I can give it a try because I just thought about it because you mentioned Switzerland, how we can grow, but Switzerland could be defined as some sort of major DAO. So basically they're just nurturing small DAOs at the end. And I guess the mindset of being used to organizing in a very good way, because like to everyone from the outside, like Switzerland is the well-organized country, although on paper you have so many building blocks. And DAOs are exactly the same thing. So if you have a country that managed to organize building blocks in a coherent system, and coming from Belgium, where you also have different building blocks that need to be fit together, I see how important it is to organize them. For a DAO, it makes sense. Like, oh, they managed to do it like at the country level. So why wouldn't the mindset is there of finding like organization and chaos, basically, like things that should not fit together at the end. And a DAO at the end of the day is also a lot of very different elements that we put in the same box to create something beautiful. Idealistically, let's say, so I guess the mentality of being used to doing this kind of efforts may help for DAOs and may be reassuring. And also thanks to that, you can always find the right place. Like Switzerland is the only place where you can just pick your canton, and each canton has their own peculiarities. So some will say choose it based on taxes, but it could also be just how do you feel more comfortable. If you're maybe French speaking, you will go to the French side. If you speak German or you prefer something on that side, go to the German side. So you can really have a lot of diversity in one place, meaning Switzerland is not just I choose Switzerland, it's I choose a canton as well. And this may be pretty convenient.
Thank you. I think we can open up the discussion. There's some questions in the public. Who's willing to break the ice this morning? Yes, Andrea.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I have a question around what the suggestion was yesterday and what you brought up now again, Isla, on sandboxes. Is there something like that in Switzerland? Has that been opened? Is there debates about it? Because in a sense, I think that all of the good invitations to Switzerland make sense, but I think then the cost associated, I mean, you gave the number out, what it was for you back then, and I think that for smaller organizations, even if it's a little less, it's still a big amount of money to put on the table to get things right. So have you heard of anything of that? Do you think it would be useful in Switzerland, or do you think that's not needed?
I'll maybe just clarify for those who were not there yesterday. So the idea of the sandbox for this one, the DAO, was to say if it's small, because we always mention like let's have an entity, let's reach out, check the regulatory aspects. But if it's very small, you have a limited number of members, it's not growing yet, you don't even know whether it will grow, whether you will attract TVL, if it's all about gathering some funds. Maybe let's not bother with these aspects. So the idea was to copy sandboxes we may have, for example, from financial regulations, and say if you have less than that many members, less than that much in money under control, we leave you aside. We check in 1 year, for example. We see the level of decentralization, how many users you have now, and then let's force you to get an entity and do things correctly. So that was the idea. Whether this exists, this is a very good question. I mean, you have some sandboxes, for example, under banking regulations and this kind of things. But in terms of avoiding setting up an entity, at least not here. I know some jurisdictions you can set up things quite easily that you don't register, for example, in the commercial register, which could be some sort of sandbox because it's easier, but a strict sandbox, I'm not sure. I leave it up to others.
I was going to say that... oh, yeah, sorry, thanks. There is a fintech sandbox that is mainly for payment processing from the FINMA, as far as I'm aware. This kind of can lean over into crypto, but it does not really focus on governance tokens. So for this specific case, I know that people at Koala have spoken with several different jurisdictions about having a sandbox, and that in Switzerland, this is not that far along yet, unfortunately.
Yes, we have the first question.
Thank you so much. And talking about sandboxes, I have a follow-up question. Like in a lot of academic papers, this term regulatory lag has been coming up over the years. And I just wanted to ask, like, how can innovation and regulation maybe build a symbiotic relationship so that, in a sense, you know, technology is not going to speed up so that we're at the situation where we're now, where we kind of have to find a wrap or find a regulatory measurement, how technology gets put into place, but how this symbiotic relationship can develop together. And is this the sandbox, or are there other opportunities how this can happen? Yeah, question to you guys.
Wants to go? Isla.
One of the DAOs that we started is called DAO. And it was kind of a bit of a joke at the beginning, but it was a serious idea of kind of having Davos for DAOs. So really bringing good DAOs to Davos, and particularly DAOs that have really this optimism for societal change, because I often feel that regulators are constantly confronted with all the scams, and just one of our goals was to really bring some of these really incredible DAOs and optimistic thinkers to Davos, and actually really have serious conversations, but not just conversations, get more into the details of kind of how this works and how it's not working. And yeah, that's one of our things. Like, we had a small event last year in Davos. Hopefully we'll do another one again this year. But yeah, it's been difficult to get funding for that. So we're kind of work in progress at the moment on that.
I can maybe just say a non-legal answer, but so I also recently had, in a private setting, an exchange with a person from FINMA who is also looking into non-incorporated crypto projects. And what she told me is they are really trying to understand all of this, but there is just so many things, new things popping up all the time. And I can really relate. I mean, even me as a researcher, it's hard to have an overview over all the different projects, all the different things, all the different innovation that is happening right now and all the time. I mean, technology develops or innovates so fast. So I'm a bit pessimistic about this symbiotic relationship, but I still think, as have been mentioned, having a conversation, trying to have this dialogue will help to close this, or to make this gap a bit smaller, at least.
Once again, go ahead.
I was just quick comment. So I think, yeah, one thing I realized, a lot of grants programs in Web3 are very focused on tech and building public good tech. I think it would be very nice to see more funding and more grants available to some of these types of discussions, or, yeah, public policy and really, yeah, things that are not just hard tech, because I think as important, certainly at this stage in the game, as the tech.
So I just say I love the point of saying we can't follow up on how many projects are popping up on a daily basis. You would need, and maybe we have some advantage with now ChatGPT. What about having a bot screening for Twitter and Discord and popping out notification to the regulator, hey, this is a new trend? Because even in academia, you need like some time to realize once the project grows, oh, this is happening. And you always have a delay. Otherwise, you would need to hire someone, like Finma would need to hire someone to run to all the conferences and look around what's happening at Build the conferences. This may happen in a very distant future, but I am not really sure about that. So let's see whether AI helps. But the other thing is it would be up to innovators to reach out to the regulator, but they will not do that as well because like, oh, do I really want to bring myself out there under their radar? So there is a problem in terms of they want the regulator to follow up on new trends, but new trends will never notify themselves because they don't want to get in trouble. So I'm not sure we have a solution anytime soon, but let's see whether maybe AI can help with that.
Thank you. Well, just to follow up on this point, I wanted to ask all of you, well, do you think the legislator in Switzerland should be more proactive in studying what is happening with the DAO space? Because, you know, we do have the DLT law, but it doesn't mention DAOs, it doesn't mention organizations. And should the Swiss legislator start to study this question of DAOs, whether or not we come up with new legislation, but just at least analyze the space, analyze what are the legal needs here in Switzerland?
I actually would say that it's more on the industry to educate the regulators. Coming from an industry that moved very impactful social technology into the world in about a decade and doing regulatory and policy work. Kind of later in the game when it was, I don't want to say too late, but when the issues got very, very heated, it was very difficult to have thoughtful conversations when regulators didn't understand the technology. And the truth is, the industry, and I'm talking like big tech, probably didn't do enough on the digital literacy front. You know, you're building, you're innovating, you're just up to doing like cool things, and you have your head down, and you're not necessarily bringing the world along with you. And that is problematic. And down the road, it compounds. So you end up in conversations like, oh, the algorithm, you know, it's like, there is no like algorithm or one algorithm. And where do you start having a conversation when you don't even have a point of reference to work from? So that is something that I'm committed to in terms of the work that we're doing at Aragon, is to build these resources, these educational resources in this common language that's very precise and very kind of accurate and true to the technology, but also accessible for everyone so that the world that is interacting with the technology can have language, constructs, concepts to have constructive conversations. And digital literacy is, I think, one of the most overlooked concepts or ideas in public policy in advancing supportive regulatory frameworks.
So I would make 2 points about what is beneficial jurisdictionally in Switzerland. And one of the things is that our regulator has much shorter feedback loops, and that is part of the reason why we are able to bring out a lot of this legislation very, very early. And, you know, it's totally possible that the same thing will happen with DAO frameworks by virtue of some kind of feedback, what is useful, what kind of governance voting you would like to have. And, I mean, that is maybe wishful thinking, but I think it's possible. And then, obviously, the other one is that I've said this a few times now, precedent helps a lot, and the fact that, you know, we already have DAOs really means that it's taken more seriously by our regulator, because there is a perception that it is something that can add to international competitiveness in a way that many larger and just, you know, other jurisdictions do not consider. And so that really helps in terms of timing.
Thank you. So we have a question from Professor Weber. I'm sorry, your mic is not on, I think.
Okay. Thank you. As correctly said by the panelists, we do have sandbox regulation in the fintech environment, more concretely contained in the Swiss banking ordinance. However, this regulation is limited to the scope of FINMA supervision. We don't have sandbox regulations in other areas because in Switzerland, by the way, as in most other civil law countries, we do have a so-called numerous clauses or closed number of legal forms and types in our law, and these types contained in the law do know a lot of mandatory provisions, and within this framework you cannot just not do a sandbox. So if at all, a sandbox would only be possible as far as we do have non-mandatory provisions, and that's a little bit difficult, for example, with governance tokens.
Thank you for that comment. We have a question in the back. Oh, sorry. Yes, only. Let me see.
So you have brought up, several of you, that it might not be so interesting to make always a DAO, depending on the activity of the organization, and that DAOs are natively borderless because they emerge and operate mostly on blockchain. But it's also apparent to me that for now they're very self-referential. All these grants that many of these DAOs are granting is for building technology, but we are yet to see DAOs that are operating more on more physical matters. So one question for you would be: do you imagine that it might be interesting for local communities to incorporate as DAOs? Do you see affordances that DAOs provide on governance matters that may be beneficial rather than having a normal association? And if so, does it outweighs the costs or the complications of onboarding people? Or would you even imagine that they become parts of even some of those limited number of legal forms because they help maybe the administration, like using the blockchain as the official registry? What are your views on these matters?
Okay, microphones are not my thing. So when you started with would there be communities, it's even like communities or projects could be DAOs, or at least something decentralized relying on blockchain, because I mean, it goes down to what is a DAO, when do we have enough elements to legitimately describe ourselves as DAO. But anything that's impact related, there's a lot of places in the world where accessing to banking and financial services is a nightmare, where reaching out to regulators and discussing things with regulators is a nightmare as well. So if you can just do all of this on chain and organize yourself in a more structured manner, because also it could be that in this kind of regions, setting up everything, like having an entity and so on, is complicated. Some real-life projects could be structured based on funds that are on the blockchain with a treasury, and then you have some NFT holders because they choose a non-fungible, let's say, model that can access to it, and what do we do with these funds? So yeah, there's a lot of, I would say, real-life cases for anything that's impact-related in major parts of the world, and we don't explore it yet. So when we mention all these experiments in how do we govern the DAO, and like you mentioned also grants where DAO basically finance themselves and create a closed-loop ecosystem of I finance another project that will help me out directly. I think this is still the experimenting part, and it seems odd maybe from the outside, but it's super useful because this will help to identify which tools work and what can be done, so that once people want to set up these impactful projects, they can use them. Or if they want to set up something else that has nothing to do with impact but also can be justified. Like yesterday I was laughing about the garden project, like tokenizing pumpkins and then swapping things on chain and deciding for a DAO vote. But maybe if you have a major region where it's super complicated to have agricultural projects, and sometimes it's all dry, sometimes it's raining too lot, you could maybe justify over time having some sort of cooperative model, something else that relies on blockchain. And based on our definition, this would be a DAO. So imagine having different farmers gathering together and then, let's say, putting together proceeds of their sales and trying to reinvest them depending on where it's needed. I could definitely see how this is being used for that, but we're not there yet because these tools are still not easy to understand to most of the people. So we're clearly in the experimenting phase, which seems odd, but is extremely useful. So I'm curious to see what happens in a year because it moves super fast. So for now we're experimenting, but when I compare to, you mentioned DAO before, it was just beginning of this year. And it feels like so much happened in between. And there was so many evolutions in the space. So by end of next year, we may reach that point. I mean, that would be beautiful. Maybe we'll not be there, but we'll have a lot of different things and we'll be 10 steps further than we are now.
Thank you. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I would have a response to your comment. And also, it is, like, I think, a good reference back to what Professor Weber just said about the numerous clauses, the idea that you would need to have in the code of obligations and in the civil code something be entered as a new corporate entity, and it's hard to experiment with. So what I would say to your questions about when a new form is beneficial, the real impediment at the moment is that you need to have some kind of clear way to off-ramp or interact with the traditional financial system for a lot of your operations at the moment. And an interesting thing that is emerging with fintech payment processes in the Eurozone and also in Switzerland is that you can now have self-custodial KYC'd transfers of stable coins to IBAN payment processors. So technically now you can do that with an unrecognized or different entity. You might still have liability as a natural person or something, but with this entity, you can technically now do that without a corporate form, have some kind of off-ramping payments. That is really the bottleneck.
Okay, so we have our last question right now. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering, I think this is kind of going to be a follow-up on the last question. With regard to NFTs, we are hearing, although I'm not a believer in that, the NFTs were a bubble and they're going to burst. What do you think about DAOs and their future? What do you expect in the next 1-2 years to come? Are we going to see more DAOs? Are they going to increase? Are we going to see more registered DAOs? Or are, in Sven's and Professor Guillaume's terms, maverick DAOs, it will emerge? I'm just curious to hear your opinions. Thank you very much.
I will somewhat merge the two questions because I wanted to add my 2 cents. The kind of question of why would you choose a DAO as opposed to another type of entity and what the future of DAOs can look like. The biggest question is, what are you doing on chain? Like, why are you building on the blockchain? What are you up to? And that is why you would govern something on chain, because there is an on-chain element. And roughly speaking, I mean, the definition around DAOs, I am not convinced. I think there's a lot of swirl in the industry around this as to whether the definition has evolved in like a helpful way or in a confusing way. And it's probably going to need to get a little bit more specific as to what we're actually talking about. But you do have, an on-chain deployment. You have an address that is the DAO. And so you're holding something on-chain, holding some kind of on-chain asset, whether that is our tokens, NFTs, a protocol, a set of smart contracts. There are different things that you can govern. And then you have membership and a way to construct census on chain. And that can look different as well. So we're used to tokens, for instance, and often they're liquid, but they can look like a lot of things. Not necessarily a fungible token, it can be a non-fungible token. You can whitelist addresses, and you can construct census in different ways as well in order to have a governance mechanism, which is like on-chain logic that'll trigger actions on what's in the vault. And deconstructing the definition in that way, I feel, and getting a little bit more granular about what we mean when we say DAO or when we talk about on-chain governance, I feel like it can open a world of possibilities that we haven't imagined yet. And part of the reasons that we re-architected the tech stack from the protocol level is to allow for that level of granularity and that level of modularity in governance design, so that you can construct a lot more kind of specific and sophisticated governance systems that truly meet the needs of what you're up to on-chain and why you're building on the blockchain and what you're trying to do. So I think we haven't really scratched the surface yet, I guess, is my short answer.
Okay, thanks for the question. So, as for the status as of now, I can speak in my two heads. So, at one part is the researcher, so at the ZHAW, and there I see DAOs are now, there are many open questions, many challenges in DAOs that are not solved yet, that will also be interesting in the future. So, to do research on DAOs, it's a very great time at the moment, I would say. On the other hand, at DAO Suisse, we founded DAO Suisse because there was an interest of people, of organizations that wanted to have this dialogue, this platform, this knowledge creation. And as long as we see this interest, and at the moment we have this interest, we will continue to work on this also, yeah, for the future. About the future of DAOs, I'm not sure whether in the future we will have all exactly these on-chain DAOs, that maybe there are many ways or many different views. You can have we also heard many views in this conference, a very puristic view, very decentralized DAOs, but then some DAOs with legal entities, and then also I think Grace also mentioned this, that some elements of DAOs can be used in a project, but you don't need to be a full DAO in the end. And also Jessica mentioned this, that we devise some new governance tools that can be very, very interesting for coordinating online or digital communities in the future. So I'm quite confident that all of this will bring something of value in the future that helps us coordinate people, govern people and projects in the online realm. How exactly it will look like, it's hard to tell at this moment. So we have to figure out.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic about the future of DAOs. I think, as Jessica said, we're really just scratching the surface, and I think sometimes we forget how early we are in this development. I really hope it doesn't take 2,000 years, but sort of remembering that it kind of took democracy until now so long to develop into something that was embraced kind of globally or semi-globally. Yeah, I think it's very interesting seeing I was speaking to a researcher who was saying the UN will eventually become a DAO, and then seeing organizations like UNESCO and other international organizations taking an interest. And I think it's also inspiring our generation to think about public goods and think about doing good in society in a more structured and coordinated manner. And I do think that there's a huge amount of potential being unlocked there. But yeah, it's at the very early phases. Yeah.
I was just about to wrap up with one sentence. The future, I would say, based on all of this, is that we will forget about DAOs, but have plenty of DAOs. It's the same with tokens and tokenization and blockchains. We will not mention it anymore, but we'll have plenty of community-based projects that use the entire infrastructure and all these tools, but it will not be explicitly mentioned. I can't imagine UN DAO as a name. They will just say it's the UN, and then they rely on some sort of blockchain-based process to vote, maybe ideally in the future. So we'll just forget the DAO aspect, just because we dispute the definition a lot as well. Is it the right way of defining things? What's the automated part in that? So we'll just forget that, but we have more of it and better quality, I would say, hopefully.
Well, thank you so much for those comments. We're running a bit out of time, but I have been allowed one last question. So please,
That's very, very kind of you, and maybe more than a question is a provocation. I definitely agree with what Jessica said. That is the task of the practitioner and of the industry to instruct the state, and not maybe the other way around. But in Switzerland, we have this process of consultation. So when the state is asking the industry and the academia to teach them about something, and we had in Switzerland 2 major consultations about DLT. And so my question to the practitioner in this room: has any one of you participated in this consultation and tried to bring up some of your studies about DAOs? Because I was just looking to the results of the consultation, I cannot see anything about DAOs. So have you been involved? Maybe Sven, have you been involved in these consultations by the Swiss state?
So I have to say no. Personally, I have not been involved in the consultation, but maybe some of our guests today have.
It's a no from me. I don't know, how do you do that? Do you have to volunteer yourself? Are you invited? How does it work?
It was too early for DAOs back then. Like, we were still figuring out tokens, so it was too early for DAOs. They popped up on the public scene a bit too late for that. But let's see, maybe there'll be a second opportunity to mention DAOs in a different consultation. So is there someone who has a yes to that question?
I also have a no personally, but I would be, first of all, I would be very open to an invitation, of course. But at DAO Swiss, it's also one of our aims to start this conversation. And we have some plans to also contact and have some initial meetings with some of the authorities to, I think, first teach them a bit or explain about DAOs, and then also maybe have further discussions on this. It's probably not yet a consultation. I think we're not yet at this state. So it's, I think, our duty at the moment to approach them rather than the opposite way. That's just how it is at the moment.
But there's hope at EU level. So it's not only Switzerland, there's hope at EU level, and then we're on time, so it's good.
And I would say also in the UK, there's this big consultation happening at the moment right now. And hopefully we can do something similar in the coming years here in Switzerland. It'd be great. Okay, well, it is time to wrap up this great panel. Thank you so much to all of our speakers today. I think we can have a round of applause for them.